In a quiet bakery, a loaf of bread rests on a wooden table. Its crust is golden and warm. It looks simple, almost peaceful. Steam rises slowly from its surface. A knife cuts through the crust with a soft crack. Inside, the bread is soft and white. Today, bread feels ordinary. It is everywhere, on breakfast tables, in markets. But there was a time when bread was not peaceful. There was a time when bread caused anger, and even riots. Crowds once filled the streets because of it. Not for gold, not for land, but for bread. How could something so basic become so dangerous? How could flour and water lead to violence? The story begins in a city of stone and narrow streets. A city where ovens burned from dawn until night. This city was Paris, the heart of 18th century France, a place of beauty and tension. In Paris, bread was not a side dish. It was life itself. For many families, it was most of their daily food. A worker might eat 2 or 3 pounds of bread each day. It filled the stomach. It gave strength for long hours of labor. For the poor, bread was survival. Without it, there was hunger. And hunger does not stay quiet for long. Each morning, women lined up outside bakeries. They waited in the cold. They held small coins in their hands. They did not wait for cakes. They did not wait for sweets. They waited for plain bread. But something was changing in France. The weather had turned cruel. The harvest had begun to fail. Heavy rains flooded the fields. Later, harsh winters froze the soil. Wheat crops suffered. When wheat suffers, bread suffers. And when bread suffers, people suffer. The price of flour slowly began to rise. At first, the increase was small, almost unnoticeable. But for a poor family, even a small increase mattered. Bread already cost much of their income. Now it cost even more. Fathers worked long hours in workshops. Mothers stretched every coin. Children felt the hunger first. The strange part was, the rich did not feel it the same way. Their tables were still full. In grand houses, dinners continued as usual. Roasted meats and fine wine filled the rooms. Bread was only one small part of the meal. But in small homes, bread was everything. When the price doubled, fear doubled too. Rumors began to spread through the markets. People whispered about hoarding. They whispered about secret storage of grain. Some believed merchants were hiding wheat. They believed bakers were cheating them. Trust began to disappear. Lines outside bakeries grew longer. Voices grew louder. Faces grew more tense. A single empty shelf could start an argument. A late delivery could cause shouting. Few people knew the full truth. Harvest failures were real. Transport was slow and difficult. But when people are hungry, patience is thin. Explanations do not fill the stomach. One morning, a bakery ran out of bread before noon. The door closed early. The crowd did not leave. A woman knocked on the wooden door. Then another. Soon, many hands were pounding. The baker stood inside, afraid. He had no more flour. He had no more loaves to sell. Outside, anger grew like a storm cloud. Voices rose above the street noise. Someone shouted that the baker was lying. Someone else shouted that the grain was hidden. A stone flew through the air. Glass shattered. The crowd gasped. What happened next surprised everyone. More stones followed. The door shook under the force of fists. The baker's family hid in the back room. Fear replaced the smell of fresh bread. This was not just about one bakery. This was about weeks of rising prices. About empty plates at home. In other neighborhoods, similar scenes unfolded. Angry groups gathered in front of ovens. Some demanded lower prices. Others demanded that officials step in. The local authorities tried to calm the crowds. They promised more grain was coming. They asked for patience. But promises are weak when children are crying. Hunger makes words feel empty. Soon, the anger moved beyond bakeries. It reached the city squares. It reached the government buildings. People began to question more than bread prices. They questioned the system itself. Why was bread so expensive? Why were the poor always the first to suffer? In the countryside, farmers faced their own struggles. Bad harvests meant less to sell, less to survive on. Wagons carrying grain were sometimes stopped. Crowds searched them. They demanded fair prices. These actions were called bread riots. But they were more than simple fights over food. They were signs of deeper frustration, signs of a society under pressure. France was already in debt. The government had spent heavily on wars. Taxes were high, but the tax burden did not fall equally. The poorest paid much. The richest paid little. Bread became a symbol. It stood for fairness. It stood for survival. Every loaf carried more than flour and water. It carried hope or despair. As the months passed, tension filled the air of Paris. Markets felt different. People watched each other carefully. The city that once smelled of warm bread now smelled of fear. Whispers moved faster than carts of grain. Few people understood how close the country was to change. All they knew was that bread was scarce. And when bread disappears, something else rises. Anger, desperation. In quiet homes, mothers counted slices carefully. They cut thinner pieces each day. Children asked for more. Parents had nothing to give. The story of bread was no longer about baking. It was about power, about justice. And in the streets of Paris, a simple loaf was becoming a spark that would soon light something far greater than a riot. The tension did not disappear overnight. It settled into the streets like a heavy fog. People woke each morning with the same question. Would there be bread today? In the markets, conversations grew sharper. Neighbors spoke in low voices. They shared stories of empty ovens and rising prices. Some blamed the weather. Others blamed the merchants. Many blamed the king. France was ruled by King Louis XVI. He lived far from the narrow streets of Paris, far from the bakery lines. Inside the Palace of Versailles, life felt different. Large halls shimmered with mirrors and candles. Music echoed through polished rooms. At royal dinners, bread was never missing. It sat quietly beside silver plates. It did not carry fear there. But outside the palace gates, fear was growing. The cost of a single loaf now took most of a worker's daily wage. Imagine working all day and spending almost everything on bread alone. Nothing left for meat. Nothing left for firewood. Families began skipping meals. Some mixed flour with cheaper grains. The bread became darker and heavier. But the strange part was, even that cheaper bread was hard to find. In some towns, crowds stopped grain shipments. They forced sellers to lower prices. They called it justice. To officials, it looked like disorder. To hungry families, it looked like survival. Local leaders tried to control prices. They set limits. They made new rules for bakers. But rules could not create wheat. Paper laws could not grow crops. The winter of 1788 was especially cruel. Rivers froze. Roads became difficult to travel. When transport slowed, grain arrived late. When grain arrived late, bakeries ran empty. In Paris, long lines turned into shouting matches. People pushed closer to the doors. A rumor spread that grain was being hidden, that wealthy traders were waiting for prices to rise even higher. Few people knew what was true, but hunger made every rumor believable. In taverns, workers spoke openly about injustice. They spoke about taxes and unfair laws. The poorest citizens paid heavy taxes, but nobles and clergy often paid little. This system had existed for years. But now, bread made it impossible to ignore. When the stomach is full, people endure unfairness. When the stomach is empty, endurance fades. In the spring of 1789, the crisis steepened. Bread prices reached record highs. Crowds gathered not just at bakeries, but in public squares. They demanded action from the government. The king called a meeting known as the Estates General. Representatives from across France were invited. For many, this meeting brought hope. Perhaps change was finally coming. Common people wanted fairer taxes. They wanted stable bread prices. They wanted to be heard. But inside the meeting halls, arguments grew intense. Nobles and commoners disagreed on voting power. Outside, the streets grew restless. Patience was running out. One hot July day, tension reached a new level. Soldiers gathered near Paris. Cannons stood ready. People feared the king would silence them by force. Fear quickly turned into determination. Crowds searched for weapons. They moved toward a large stone prison called the Bastille. The Bastille was not only a prison. It was a symbol of royal power. On July 14th, 1789, thousands surrounded its walls. They demanded gunpowder and arms. The air was thick with smoke and shouting. Shots rang out. After hours of fighting, the Bastille fell. Its gates were broken. The fall of the Bastille shocked the nation. It marked the beginning of the French Revolution. But behind the political speeches and the fallen stones, there was a simpler truth. Bread had played a quiet but powerful role. Hunger had pushed people into the streets. The revolution was about freedom and rights, but it was also about survival. Women, especially, felt the pressure deeply. They were often the ones who bought bread each day. They faced angry bakers. They faced empty shelves. They carried the worries of their families. They listened to children cry from hunger. In October 1789, another dramatic moment arrived. Bread was still scarce in Paris. A group of women gathered in the rain. They held simple tools and kitchen knives. They began marching toward Versailles. It was many miles away. As they walked, more people joined them. Their footsteps echoed on wet roads. They did not march for luxury. They marched for bread. When they reached the palace, they demanded to see the king. They demanded action. The palace guards were overwhelmed by the crowd. Voices filled the courtyards. The women insisted that the king return to Paris. They wanted him close to the people. Under pressure, the royal family agreed. They left the palace for the capital. As their carriage rolled toward Paris, the crowd followed closely behind. Some carried loaves of bread on sticks. They lifted them like symbols of victory. The message was clear. The king must understand hunger. This was the first great reveal of the crisis. Bread was no longer only food. It had become a political force, a force strong enough to move a king. Few people had predicted this. Few imagined that loaves could reshape a nation. But in France, flour and water had turned into power, and the story was far from over. Paris felt different after the king arrived. The royal family now lived among the people. But bread was still scarce. Markets remained tense. Women still stood in long lines before sunrise. The revolution had begun, but hunger had not ended. New leaders stood in public squares. They gave speeches about liberty and equality. Crowds listened carefully, but many asked the same quiet question. Where's the bread? Grain supplies were unstable. Bad harvests continued in some regions. Transport was often interrupted by unrest. Wagons moved slowly through uncertain roads. When a shipment arrived safely, relief spread quickly. When it did not, fear returned. The government tried new controls. They fixed prices on bread and grain. This law was called the maximum. It was meant to protect the poor. But controlling prices created new problems. Some farmers refused to sell at low rates. They feared losing money. They feared feeding cities while their own families struggled. Grain began to disappear from official markets. Black markets quietly appeared. Secret deals took place at night. Flour was sold for high prices in hidden rooms. Officials searched for hoarders. They inspected warehouses and barns. Suspicion grew everywhere. Neighbors watched neighbors. If someone had extra bread, questions followed. Where did it come from? Accusations spread faster than proof. Fear turned into anger. In some towns, crowds attacked suspected grain traders. They dragged sacks of wheat into the streets. Sometimes the grain was shared. Sometimes it was destroyed in rage. The revolution was entering a darker phase. Trust in leaders was fragile. The National Assembly debated new rights and laws. But outside, hunger remained real. Radical voices began to rise. They promised strong action. They said enemies were everywhere. Enemies of the revolution. Enemies of the people. Bread shortages were blamed on traitors, on secret royal supporters. The strange part was fear of hunger now mixed with fear of betrayal. Public anger became easier to ignite. A rumor could fill a square within hours. Crowds demanded swift punishment. They demanded justice without delay. The guillotine appeared in public spaces. Its blade shone under the sun. Executions were meant to protect the revolution, but they also deepened the atmosphere of fear. During this time, bread still shaped daily life. Even revolutionary leaders worried about supplies. Committees were formed to manage grain. Soldiers escorted shipments to cities. In villages, farmers faced pressure to produce more. They were told their wheat was patriotic duty. Some complied. Others resisted quietly. Food shortages spread beyond Paris. Other cities felt similar tensions. Lyon, Marseille, smaller towns along rivers. Everywhere, bread symbolized survival. Everywhere, it influenced loyalty. If the government provided bread, people felt hopeful. If it failed, doubt grew stronger. Foreign countries watched carefully. They saw France weakened by unrest. War soon followed. France fought against neighboring powers. War demanded soldiers and supplies. It also demanded grain. Armies needed bread as much as civilians did. Fields became even more important. But war disrupted farming. Young men left villages to fight. With fewer hands in the fields, harvests suffered again. Prices fluctuated wildly. Inflation weakened the value of money. Paper currency lost trust. People trusted bread more than paper. In crowded bakeries, arguments turned physical. People pushed and shouted. Some bakeries were forced to close early. Owners feared violence. Local guards stood near ovens. They tried to maintain order. What happened next surprised many observers. Food became a test of revolutionary ideals. Liberty promised freedom. Equality promised fairness. But empty stomachs questioned both promises. Radical leaders tightened control. They punished suspected hoarders harshly. The reign of terror began to unfold. Fear ruled daily life. Public squares that once demanded bread now witnessed executions. Yet even in this dark period, bread remained central to every conversation. Mothers still counted slices at the table. They still worried about tomorrow. Children still asked the same question. Will there be enough? Revolutionary slogans echoed through streets. But hunger echoed inside homes. In time, some harvests improved. Grain supplies slowly stabilized. Markets began to feel slightly calmer. Lines shortened a little. But the damage had already spread. Trust had been broken. The king was eventually executed. France became a republic. Years of instability followed. New leaders rose and fell. Through all this change, bread remained a silent measure, a measure of stability. If bread was affordable, peace seemed possible. If it was not, unrest returned. The revolution had started with ideas, but had been fueled by hunger, and the effects spread far beyond France. Other nations watched and learned. They saw how quickly scarcity could ignite change. They understood that food security was power. By the late 1790s, France slowly found new balance. A new leader named Napoleon Bonaparte emerged. He understood something important. An army marches on its stomach. He prioritized supply lines and grain storage. He knew bread meant loyalty. The era of chaos slowly shifted, but the memory of bread riots remained. People did not forget the years of hunger. They did not forget the shattered bakery windows. They did not forget how flour and water had shaken a kingdom. The escalation had changed France forever, and the world had been watching. But the full lesson of the bread riots was deeper than politics. It was about something simple and human. When survival is threatened, even the smallest loaf can move history. Years passed, and the fires of revolution slowly cooled. But memories of hunger did not fade. In quiet kitchens, families still spoke about those days. They remembered the long lines. They remembered the fear. Bread had returned to the shelves, but trust took longer to return. Leaders learned a difficult lesson. Food is not just nourishment. It is stability. A government can survive debate. It can survive criticism, but it struggles to survive hunger. The riots of France were not the last in history. Other nations would face similar crises. In different centuries, in different cities, crowds would gather again for bread. Because when food becomes scarce, fear spreads quickly. The strange part was, the loaf itself never changed. It was still flour, still water, still yeast and heat. Yet its meaning shifted with the times. Sometimes it meant comfort. Sometimes it meant protest. In France, bread became a symbol of equality. If everyone could eat, society felt fairer. If only a few could afford it, anger returned quietly. The French Revolution reshaped laws and borders, but it also reshaped how leaders thought about food. Grain storage improved. Transport systems slowly became more organized. Governments began watching harvests carefully. They feared another crisis. Farmers gained new importance. Their work became linked to national stability. Bakers, too, held quiet power. Their ovens connected fields to families. Few people today think about that connection. Bread is often taken for granted. It sits in baskets at restaurants. It waits on supermarket shelves. But behind every loaf is a long chain of labor. Fields, mills, trucks, ovens. When that chain breaks, history reminds us what can happen. The bread riots of France were not only about food. They were about dignity. They were about the right to survive, the right to feed a family. Hunger gave courage to ordinary people. It pushed them to challenge a king. It turned quiet streets into loud protests. It turned simple loaves into powerful symbols. What began at bakery doors ended at palace gates. And from those gates, a new era was born. The twist of the story is simple. It was never only about bread. Bread was the visible sign, but beneath it lay inequality and frustration. When people cannot meet their basic needs, they begin to question everything else. They question leaders. They question systems. And sometimes they change the world. Today, we slice bread without fear. We rarely imagine riots over a loaf. But history moves in cycles. Security can feel permanent until it is not. The ovens of Paris still burn. The city is calm now. Tourists walk through old streets, unaware of the hunger that once echoed there. Yet the lesson remains quietly present. Food is more than food. It is trust between people and power. It is the foundation of peace. So the next time you see a simple loaf of bread, remember how it once shook a kingdom, and consider what small things in our world might carry more power than we realize.